What's up, Redemption? Welcome into Competitive Deck Building 101 with John Hendricks and our guest this week, Rob Smith. We're going to be talking about some of the basic principles for competitive deck building and things of that nature for all of the new players that we've got into the community recently. And we're going to also be going over some recent news that has come out within the game of Redemption. A lot of exciting things are happening right now. So without further ado, we'll get right into it. Thanks for being here. All right, thank you for joining on another episode of The Threshing Floor. John Hendricks here with Rob Smith again, the Demon Hunter himself. How you doing, Rob?
Doing good, John. How you doing, bud?
Pretty good. At this point, we're probably going to have to add you on the payroll if we keep getting you on here.
Well, that's fine. That's fine with me. I got 3 kids. I could use it.
Yeah, with gas prices, everyone needs a little bit of side hustle.
Yeah, exactly.
So tonight we're going to go over some recent news for the game and different things that have come out in the past week or so here. And then we're going to get into tonight's topic, which is going to be deck building. And I know that our friends with Thoughts from Portland, Jay and John, are discussing deck building and taking that next step where it relates to deck building and being a better player in game. But that's more geared towards players that already have a strong foundation and they're just taking the next step. So we're going to kind of try to pull it back a little bit and do it more for beginners so that you kind of have a way to start building that foundation, so to speak. So before we get into that, we'll go ahead and go over some recent news. And part of the news is, as I said, our friends at Thoughts from Portland, they are back after being on hiatus for a month. Thoughts from Portland is back, so make sure you check out their latest episode. Also, we have Lackey Grand Prix that's currently going on. We are finishing up round 3 at this point. I don't believe round 4 pairings have been announced yet. How's the Lackey Grand Prix going for you, Rob?
Not too bad. I had 2 pretty good wins, round 1 and round 2, and then round 3 I lost, but it was actually a timeout loss. So I believe it was 4-3, and that was to him or Jared, as some people might know him. So a little bit better that it was within time. I still get 1 point, but definitely made some misplaying on there. I think actually Jaden live streamed it, and yeah, there were some things that I'm looking back like, wow, I missed that. And then there were things like that Jaden just flat out told me, he's like, yeah, I shamed you. I'm like, yeah, beginner mistakes I shouldn't have made. But overall, pretty good. If I can do pretty good in my next round, I think I probably got a good solid shot at maybe making top 4. So.
And you are playing Disciples, correct?
Yes, I can't guarantee that's what I'll be playing forward, but the last 3 games were my form of Disciple speed that I collaborated with Luke Marshall to make.
Cool. And I assume that revolves around our boy Matthew.
Oh, of course.
Got that wicked draw ability. So my first round, I played against Jay. I mentioned it on the podcast with him playing the combo deck. And then I've played the combo. I've built my own combo deck and played it the last 2 weeks, and I've won those. I won 5-2 over Josh 2 weeks ago. And this past week, I played against Renee and won 5-0. Defense was pretty strong in that game. So right now, I kind of want to test some other things, but I also don't mind giving some exposure to the combo so that hopefully they go ahead and take care of it. Because if no one plays it, then no one complains about it. But if someone plays it, then people are going to complain about it, which only helps the cause.
Yeah, I agree there.
Also, in addition to the Lackey Grand Prix, we have online tournaments. Big news is that Derek Torado, owner of Your Turn Game, he mentioned wanting to do some other things with the game. And I guess part of that right now is that he wants to host these online contender tournaments to kind of generate more play geared towards beginners and whatnot. And he's been giving the permission from Rob to do sanctioned online tournaments. So you will get prize support and RNRS points for the next contender tournament, which I believe is going to be on the 2nd of April. I think that's the date, but he did put that it is tentative, making sure that he had enough players sign up. So It could change based on participation, but as long as participation is there, it's going to be on the 2nd of April. And then we have the March Online Local, which is what Chris Fashman usually hosts. And that tournament is going to be on the 26th of March, which is not this coming Saturday, but the following Saturday. So last Saturday of the month. And that's going to be your standard online local that he's been hosting for the better part of the last year, maybe more than that. In GOC news, Phase 2 was passed from the Elder Team to Cactus over this past weekend and should be going to print at some point this week. So Phase 2 is going to the printer soon, which should ensure that we have it in time for Nationals. So that's huge news, and we're all excited about that because everyone wants to crack open Phase 2. In fact, we've got 2 Phase 2 spoilers that we'll go over here shortly. One that was spoiled by our friend Rob M. in New York. I'm not even going to butcher his last name. Sorry, Rob. But Rob M. Studios on YouTube, you can go ahead and watch his spoiler video for everything that we know about Phase 2 so far. And there is a new spoiler on there. It's an angel called the Ministering Spirit, and we're going to go over it. But if you want to see the artwork, see what it looks like, you'll have to go and check out his video. And then earlier today, which seems Monday just happens to be a big news day, Chris, who we've had on the podcast a couple of times recently, he was on last week, he and Mr. Hiatus himself, which is Tyler Stevens, are kind of running point on the next few sets. And they let it out that they have the next 2 sets named and a master plan for a potential 4 to 6 additional sets after that, you know, with flexibility that if someone else wants to interject and put sets here or there, you know, they're open to change within that. But they do have a master plan, which is really cool to know that the future of the game is being planned out, not just the here and now, which we all want to see the game grow and thrive. And to know that, you know, they're as dedicated as they are to have sets that far in advance is a fantastic thing to know as a player who is investing into the game right now in the here and now. So with that, we'll go ahead and get into the 2 spoilers that we have. The aforementioned Ministering Spirit, which looks absolutely insane. The special ability is crazy. And then the return of an old favorite, 4 drachma coin, an artifact that was originally printed, I think, in Disciples. I'm not 100% sure, but it is a reprint, has an updated ability, and we'll go over that. But we'll start with the Ministering Spirit, and I'll let you go ahead, Rob. What stands out the most about this card so far?
Well, just to start off, the artwork kind of looks like a mixture of Thanos and Thor. But other than that, the ability, just first Unity. Unity. I don't think there's a Unity for silver that I know of yet. And so this card basically, I'll go ahead and read the ability. If opponent uses a draw ability, you may underdeck an evil card in a set-aside area or territory. While in battle, restrict evil enhancements with a brigade not already in battle. Cannot be prevented in his territory class. That just seems pretty good. Just putting him out there, he's probably never going to see battle. I mean, he's got lowish numbers, so he probably could get initiative if need be, but I guarantee you he's probably going to be one of the ones that's just going to sit on the bench and just start ripping territory stuff apart. You know, draw, as we've seen, is a pretty good ability, especially in GOC. You know, we've got the first and the high places, and we talked about Matthew, and Denarius is getting some play there. So drawing is probably going to be everywhere. So this right here is probably going to get some good use. And the fact that it says an evil card in a set-aside area too is another answer to Shield. So just a great card just to have sitting in your territory and just doing things. And then even if he is in battle, restricting evil enhancements, you know, and we still play, you know, multi-brigade enhancements, you know. So if he's in battle and you've got him doing something like that and they've sent out a black or a gray evil character, well, they're not going to be able to play their scattered because pale green's not in. So definitely a pretty good card there, in my opinion.
Yeah, I will say having that ability that restricts evil enhancements with a brigade not already in battle, it's kind of like a good version of Ananias, the high priest.
Yeah.
And so you have that. You have a great territory class ability. And I'll touch on the artwork. I think the artwork is pretty cool on it. What do you think about the hand stretching over the icon box?
I think that's actually pretty cool. Like at first, it's like he's almost reaching to grab his own territory class symbol right there. But the artwork is just phenomenal. I mean, everything, just like everything we've seen in GOC, the artwork is just like bumped extremely up. Even seeing some cards, you're like, man, that card is weak, but man, that art looks cool, and I just want to use it and have it. Like, it's just amazing. It's not Angel Wars, John.
Yeah, definitely. The only gripe that I could possibly have with the artwork on this card, and Gabe, don't come for me, it's just I get why this was done this way, but the cross I think should be behind the finger, because it looks like now you're separating the icon box, and now the cross is not in the part of the box, it's in front, and you're looking at layers now versus him just reaching beyond it. But I get that they wanted that to be in the forefront so that you can easily tell the icon for the card. But that's the one gripe I would have about the artwork. Other than that, I think it's really cool, and I think it continues I don't know, we're seeing this. It used to just be really subtle ways that you're getting the 3D effects, and now it's just like we're going all into it. We're leaning into it a little bit more. But definitely a great card. And I was not expecting when I clicked on Rob's video to see a new spoiler, so literally came out of nowhere for me, which just makes it that much better.
And he's CBP, John, so if they got like Confusion of Mind or something out, yeah, he's still working.
Yep. And, if they've got Jesse and then you drop that down. And you mentioned how strong drawing abilities are, and Daenerys with a draw 3. What about 4-drop McCoy? Maintaining a draw 4. While Peter is in play, you may discard to draw 4. But before that, on the ability, it adds a new layer. Because I'm pretty sure the original one just had the draw ability, if I'm not mistaken. But this is protect hand, deck, and reserve from opponents. While Peter is in play, you may discard to draw 4. And then it can be activated on Peter. So it was already mentioned in the spoiler channel when this was dropped that it's an easy draw 4. You just have Peter and then boom. But it's not quite as easy to pull off as Daenerys, because Daenerys goes and gets the character that it needs in play in order to discard for the draw. And you can put Nero in pretty much any deck, because at a certain point he makes an opponent burn a resource to beat him because of his protection, and he's CBP. So he can stand alone and make an opponent burn a resource or two. And we don't know what the new Peter's going to do at all. We don't have any idea of the ability. So depending on how that goes, he's probably not going to fit into a ton of decks in a splashable way, because they've already given a lot of like splashable abilities on Thomas and Matthew, which I'll actually go on record and say that I'm backing off of thinking that Peter is going to be an ultra rare. I do not think he's going to be, and I'll tell you why. If Matthew, with the ability that he had, was not, and Thomas the Twin was not, do you know how much more strong an ability for a disciple would have to be for them to decide that's an ultra rare? And I just don't know if you can push it that far beyond what Matthew and Thomas are. So I don't know that we're going to see an ultra rare Peter based on the power level of his ability. What do you think about that?
John, I actually would have to respectfully disagree with you there. I said for a while back that I thought Peter would be the ultra rare, and his ability could be something as crazy as he searches out, Drock McCoy or something of the effect. But whether he is or whether he's not, I'm still, this card is pretty good. And if Peter's not an ultra rare, well, I'll take the L there. But
I just thinking about what his ability would have to be though, in order to, like, even if he searches out 4-drop McCoy and activates it, okay, you get a draw 4 one time. Matthew gets that every stinking time he goes into battle, and he's not an ultra rare.
That's true.
Like, I just don't know if there's enough room for that ability to be so wow that, boom, we've got to make him an ultra rare. I think he's going to be as strong as Matthew and Thomas. And, even Simon's really good to choose the block. That's the one that chooses the blocker, right?
Mm-hmm,
yeah, so, I mean, I just don't know if there's enough room for a disciple's ability to get above what you've already seen. But, that's just one man's opinion. So
just wait and see.
And hopefully we'll get to see when we are opening boxes at Nationals, which I am so stinking stoked for Nationals.
Me and you both.
Yeah, I think it's going to be absolutely insane. So we'll go ahead and move into our conversation for the evening and talk about some introductory tips for beginners, making the step into competitive deck building. And we'll try to make sure that we approach this by using terms that are easy to understand and whatnot. And, if we use a quote unquote term like flex dominant, we'll say what that is. But we'll go ahead and just get into it. And this was inspired last minute by a conversation that came up on Discord today. I saw where one of our newer players was asking about, tips and help for how to build a deck, how to get it down to a certain number. It seems like our newer players are struggling to get decks that are close to 50. Some of them don't necessarily understand the benefit of being at 50 versus, 56, 57. So I just thought maybe, I know that John and Jay are working on, tips for advanced play, but maybe we could, do it in a more beginner-friendly way here and kind of lay down some groundwork for building a foundation for deck building. So we'll start with your objective when building a deck. What is the first thing, Rob, that you think about when you build your decks?
The first thing that I think about when building my decks, essentially what I want my offense to do. I know before, and I won't rant on too long, but when I was first getting back into the game, like I would jump on and be like, okay, I'm going to play Green Prophets and Philistines, and I had picked before I even decided anything. Like that's what I did. I just picked a brigade or a faction theme, whatever you want to call it, just because it sounded good, and I would just go with that. And then you start running into problems. Well, okay, there's lots of different ways to run these different things, but I think you really got to dial it back to, okay, what is the purpose of the game? I need to win 5 lost souls to win. Like that's no matter what, I need 5 souls, unless you're playing the cross, which, we'll see if that becomes more viable for that alternate win condition, but you're still trying to get 5 souls even with that. So the first thing that I always break down to is my offense, and not really, when I say my offense, not really like picking, I want to run silver or I want to run purple. There's different kinds of offenses. Like what do I want to do and what does my play style? Do I want, a big banding chain that's going to come in and CBN protected and just hopefully they don't have nothing? Or am I trying to go with, there's a meek offense going around? Or am I trying to pull off some of these cheese rescues with a lot of little guys like Simon, for example, choosing the blocker? And once you kind of figure out what that play style is and what you kind of want to do, then I think it's where you can go ahead. Okay, what can I do with themes with this? What can I, okay, the Genesis, if I'm picking Meek, they have a lot of great Meek support, especially with Goshen and, Book of the Law. There's a lot of things you can do. So you start with basically, and if you don't know this, I would suggest you reach out to somebody and say, hey, what kind of different types of offenses are there? And anyone, the Discord, on the boards, anybody is happy to answer you and say, hey, yeah, there's this, there's that, and kind of explain it to you too, like what each one does. But when you're building that deck, that first thing is, and I think I've heard a couple people say it, Jay's definitely been one of them, is basically coming up with the questions that you're going to ask your opponent. Because when you're going in for a rescue, you're proposing them a question and they have to figure out how to answer it. So I think that's the first step, in my opinion, in deck building, is what questions do you want to give to your opponent?
That's definitely a fair place to start. And I think it's really good to identify what is strategy versus goal, because every deck in this game, because of the way that the game is won, is you have to reach your lost soul count before the opponent. In type 2, that's 7. In type 1, that is 5. I'm pretty sure that Jaden and Tyler are really going to enjoy the fact that I gave the winning condition for type 2 first. But so everybody's trying to reach the win condition, the number of souls, before the opponent does. So the goal is that. The goal is to reach your win condition first. But then strategy is defined as an attempt to reach a goal, or the way that you're going to try to reach that goal. So now your deck strategy is how you are attempting to achieve the goal. And you mentioned there's various different ways, like if you wanted to go meek or whatnot, those are different strategies for getting your lost soul count, which you have to get 5. You have to win at least 3 in battle generally, and you get the 2 free ones. But within that, your deck can be built to do a variety of other strategies. So it can win by reaching that win condition, but doing so by controlling the opponent's hand, what's in their hand. We've seen Jaden do that against Brad in a video where he manipulated, I think it was 18 to 20 cards in his hand by getting rid of the cards in his hand just over and over. So you have hand control. Well, you have also resource manipulation, which can be done a couple of ways. You can mill your opponent by taking their resources from their deck and discarding it. You can also use the New Samaritans to manipulate resources by putting them in the reserve where they're harder to access. You can also manipulate them by making it harder for them to play their cards, which is kind of like locking down the territory with your Obeds, your Akeems that negate neutral cards, and then your Golden Calf that restricts enhancements that are being played. You can make it difficult for your opponent to use their cards to accumulate resources after you've accumulated resources. So you want to be fast and put down counters, things like that. That's a strategy. And those are ways that you are trying to achieve that win condition. And I will say that it's really important that once you decide on what your overall idea for a deck is, and maybe it's more important to decide your play style or what you want your deck to play like before you pick a theme and then try to narrow it down. You know, like you mentioned, you can't just pick, I'm going to run Green Prophets and Philistines without knowing, what the best options in the game are for achieving your goal and what strategy you're going to use to achieve that. But once you decide on a strategy for your deck, every single card slot needs to be optimized with that in mind. And that means offense, defense, lost souls, dominance, all of your support cards. So every card slot needs to be done with your strategy in mind. Is that something that you do routinely? Because I know that I evaluate with the overall goal in mind when I do that. Is that something that you do as well, Rob?
I have more recently. I will say that like in the past, not as much. Like it kind of strays a little bit. Like I might find something that's like, oh, that's a neat little 2-3 card combo, but it doesn't really align with what my deck is trying to do. But more recently, yes, every card that I put in is either contributing to the goal of the deck or it is in there to stop a particular counter that I know will stop me from you doing my goal, if that makes sense.
Yep.
And every card should be, and we have the reserve and like just a card off the top of my head, Feast of Booths. Great card. I love the card. But when I was playing it, I would find that like, okay, I had a couple times where I opened it in my opening hand. Well, that's a brick. And just while we're defining terms, brick just means that card's pretty much going to be dead or useless in my opening hand because the chances they have something in their discard pile for me to banish to draw, slim to none. Most likely none. So something like that, it could be good toward what you're trying to do, but it should probably put it in your reserve because it's something you're not going to – anything that you don't want to see in your opening hand, like I either wouldn't play that card or I would put it in reserve. Just my opinion in that. And
you mentioned starting with your offense, and that's a really good place to start. In fact, it's where I start most of the time. And then the defense is kind of like accentuating that or, going with it just to try to make sure you have enough time to achieve your win condition. And that's another thing to keep in mind when you're building a deck from a beginner's perspective. And that is that the game has 2 resources. There's no cost to put cards in play like mana or any rules that restrict how many you can put in play each turn. So you don't have to worry about that. The resources that you have are the cards and your ability to get to your cards in your deck, and then the time that you have to win the game. And the time I'm not speaking about in terms of, okay, this is the Lackey Grand Prix, you have an hour and a half to win a game. Obviously, you have time that you're having to keep up with so that you're not getting timed out, like Rob did in his last round. But
that's true.
What I mean is, if I go first, I have an advantage because I'm closer to getting to 5 than my opponent. And the only way that stops in that path to 5 is if they get a block, or I can maintain my advantage by getting a block on them or increase that. Time is basically the number of turns that you need to reach your win condition. So if you go first and you can win in 3 turns reasonably, then that means your opponent in order to get 3 turns to do the same, they're already at the point in the game that they need a block in order to string it out to potentially win, because they need 3 turns to reach theirs. And if you get a soul, they get a soul, you get a soul, they get a soul, you get a soul, and you play your free ones on turn 3, then you're going to reach 5 before they get their third battle phase. So time is relative to how much time you have in terms of turns to reach your win condition. So what you want to do is you want to start with your offense. I think that's a great starting point. It's how I build most of my decks. And then you are posing questions like Rob mentioned, that other people have used that as an example. You're posing a question to an opponent. Well, you want to make that question as difficult to answer as possible. So when you look at heroes that you can push into battle, let's use Jeremiah and Moses, friend of God. Which one of those would you rather push into battle, Rob?
Jeremiah.
Why is that, Rob?
Well, Moses, friend of God, he's got, I think he makes, was it Exodus Plague, CBN, but that's going to require you to have initiative. But Jeremiah is going to, 1, look at your opponent's hand, so you're going to know what their resources are, and then 2, he's going to toss the next evil enhancement played against you.
Absolutely. So if you reveal their hand and they only have 1 evil enhancement, now they're at the mercy of an evil character going and getting a second enhancement and, burning 1 to... Basically, you're creating attrition with Jeremiah because you're going to burn a resource, or you're going to get a soul, or you're going to be put in a situation where they're going to, push a blocker that doesn't need an enhancement necessarily to have higher numbers, whether that's by a band or whatnot. And then you get initiative to play an enhancement. And in that case, you play an enhancement. That's a battle winner. You're tossing the next. So that's a good situation for you to be in. If you happen to lose the battle, guess what happens to Jeremiah? Go ahead and tell him, Rob.
He goes back on the top of the deck.
And then guess what? He's got a star ability that's going to negate souls until the end of turn when you draw him again.
And most of the time, if you're playing him, you're also playing Jeshua, so he's just going to come right back. There you go, Jay. You mentioned Jeshua.
Jeremiah is a better overall rescuer than Moses in most applications. That's not to say that Moses isn't a great hero. In certain applications, his star ability is really clutch for combo-esque decks. And if you play, Exodus Plagues and things, and you build around that, then obviously he would be a better hero for you. But standalone, you can identify which heroes are going to work better as a standalone piece. Have you had any experience doing that where you pick like one hero and then start building around that? I think basically that's what you're doing with your disciples and your Matthew, correct?
That's 100% it. So I don't mind telling a quick story. I was interested in the disciples, and when we first, everybody was doing all the opening the boxes, and we were looking at the cards, actually having them. I just I got all 9 disciples, threw them all into a deck, and then was like, wait a minute, I need to back off on this. And I looked at it, I said, what, Matthew's ability is really busted. And the fact that he's going to be converted to Meek, even after you do that, they're not going to be able, I think he's CBI anyway. So he's basically there's 2 ways that he's going to be negated. They're not going to stop that. But I picked him. I was like, you know what? He's a great rescuer, especially turn 1. Turn 1, it's very little chance their storehouse is out or anything to protect their hand. So not 1, I'm going to get hand knowledge. I'm going to see what they open with, what's in their hand. And then 2, hopefully draw a lot of cards. And if I'm drawing a lot of cards, then maybe the goal of this deck should be to just start dropping counters. Maybe I can draw into Sheol or Babel and put them in a game state that kind of locks them down. So Luke actually beat me in the first Grand Prix when I was running Priest. And then so we were messaging back and forth, and we both had this equal love for Matthew. And the card of it was, so, hey, well, let's start, building this, and let's start with him, which is what I said, starting with your offense. And then when you go to the offense, you look, okay, if my goal is that I want Matthew turn 1, how am I doing that? And then so one by one, it started coming into, okay, there's reassuring angels, there's angel from the sun, there's angel of the winds, there's different characters that can go get him. So I don't necessarily have to open with him if I just have enough tutors, and tutors are cards that let you search for something you need, to get him, so that I'm guaranteeing that. And then, of course, if you're using the Lord's Prayer, Spirit as a Dove, we just slowly start adding in the offense, and you start seeing these tutor cards and then other cards that kind of go with him. That basically, I forget, we counted up one day, and Luke, forgive me if I'm wrong, it's anywhere between 10 and 15 ways to get Matthew turn one, just in the offense. Obviously, Patmos is in there as well. And then also Reassuring Angels and Patmos can get him from the discard pile if need be. But so we just built that offense, and it was centered around Matthew, and that was the goal of the deck, is let's get him out there, let's draw a bunch, let's start dropping the counters, and hopefully kind of pin him down a little bit right there. But yeah, that's a good example of, we just started with an idea, but let's use Matthew. We didn't pick purple, we didn't pick, a kind of a theme. Just, this is what we want. This is what we want the deck to do. So every card we're adding into it afterwards needs to support that.
That is absolutely the way that I built a deck last year, and I'll go ahead and mention King Noah, because and this goes with my next point, is that you want to manage your ideal rescues when you start building that offense with realistic resource dedication. And what that means is that you don't want to have this strategy that requires you to have 20 different cards to pull it off. If it's that difficult to pull off in type 1, you will lose the game before you ever pull that off. I mean, I think we can all agree there. If you're not streamlined to the point to where you can pull this off at least by turn 2 with your main rescue being on the board, then that strategy is going to be too slow, more than likely, for what the game is currently in its game in the current state. So I started out last year with, actually it was the fall before, in 2020, when we had some regional tournaments after nationals because of the COVID pandemic and whatnot. So I actually started building Genesis, and then it morphed. About February, I started building around Noah, and I had this idea that I would use Noah, and the reason that I would use Noah is similar to the example of Jeremiah, is that if you get Noah standalone, he's a good rescue, because he comes in and he prevents cards, he shuffles a card, he's meek, he can trigger Book of the Law. There's all kinds of things you can do with just his ability. And I mentioned Book of the Law, but without that, you come in, prevent cards. That's a strong question that you've posed to your opponent, and now they have to answer it. And most of the time, it's difficult to answer it because Scatter doesn't work on him if you're not banding with the CBN, shuffle or whatever. So you do that, and then you can add in. You start layering. You get protection from Mary if you want to go that route. You can do Book of the Law to trigger, extra searches and things. And my favorite thing about it was that with all the identifiers and things, you can take that strong hero and you can build it several different ways. One of the ways that I settled on was, hey, when he converts to meek, he's purple. Let me put, a royal priesthood on him in territory, push him out, and trigger Throne of David. So as soon as you block, I get to play an enhancement. But I've also used Hidden Treasures so that when my Green Prophet enters battle, I get to play an enhancement. So I'm playing 2 enhancements most of the time before you get to play one, and he's top decking things with Book of the Law from reserve, Threshing Floor, and Jeshua are ways to get whatever you top deck. And I just started building it around that. And so all I needed turn 1 to have a solid rescue was Noah by himself. I didn't need everything else. Everything else was just adding to it, layering it up for future turns. And I think that's similar to how you guys are approaching with your Matthew strategy, is you just get him turn 1, and he's going to lead you to other resources that are going to help you later on in the game, versus I've got to have all this set up before whatever idea I have works. So I think that's really the way to pose those questions to your opponent, is to start out with a couple of heroes that are going to be strong rescues on their own, and then start to build out your strategy around that, keeping that in mind. And then another thing, you mentioned that you guys had, what was it, 12 to 15 ways to get to your Matthew?
Something around
And
there, yeah.
I think I had 10 or 11 ways, including organically drawing him to get to Noah in my King Noah deck. And so you build it and you make sure that it's consistent to get to at least the first piece of that. And then you start layering things on top of it. And then you build your hero lineup to support that. And I think nowadays what you really need is you only need one or two heroes that you're really wanting to rescue with, because everything else can be built to support those heroes because you're able to get them so much, like you having 12 to 15 ways or 10 or 11 ways to get to Noah. You have ways to get to your primary rescues. And you start to build that, you come up with an offense. Now, if you come up with an offense that has 40 cards, by the time that you get ready to add your defense and your lost souls and your dominance, probably not a good offense, at least for type 1.
Yeah, I would agree with that. If you're that high, I mean, and that, I guess that's might be maybe later. I'll talk to it about it a little bit later. But I build the offense, and if I have 20 heroes or 10 good enhancements, which is obviously way too high, that'll be my basic start. And then once the deck is completed, I'll start fine tuning. And all right, I'm cutting this, I'm cutting that. Like at the beginning, I kind of just throw everything in that looks like it could work, and then start going through each card and like, okay, does it really work, or is this just something that I think is a cool trick? And so you're gonna fine tune it down. Don't think, and even after you play test it, you're gonna be changing things. I'm still changing things.
Yes,
in the deck.
if you ever stop changing things when you play games, then that deck has probably reached its end cycle, because once I don't know that there's a deck out there that ever gets to a point to where you're like, nope, I'm set. No matter what I play, this is it. You're constantly thinking about what you're going to play and changing things. And if you don't think there's anything you can change, you've almost boxed yourself into a corner. You have to have these cards in order to pull it off, but now you don't have any flexibility to change it as the meta changes and adapt to it, then that deck's probably reaching the end of its life cycle. So we'll kind of shift over. Once you get your offense and you're within some certain standards of how many cards and resources you've dedicated to it, it's consistent, or what you think is going to be consistent, and then you start building your defense. And offense wins you the game. You cannot win this game without offense. So offense does win you the game. Defense earns you more time. And that's back to how many turns it takes for you to reach your win condition. So when you start looking at the ways that you can help make sure that you are in a position to win, is make sure that you build your defense just like you're posing a question to an opponent. So if me and you are playing, Rob, and I push Noah out and he's got a Royal Priesthood on and he flips to Meek, and now I'm grabbing a card from reserve, and you're going to block from hand and give me another search from my deck. I just top decked and drew Authority of Christ, the old version, just assuming because that was built in Classic. And now when you block from hand, I'm going to get to play an enhancement. Now, off of Throne, I can't play Authority of Christ, so because it's not Old Testament. But you're going to give me another search in my deck. When you block from hand, I'm triggering Threshing Floor. I've got all this going on, and you are looking there, and say this is turn 2. Now you have a difficult question to answer. I think that's fair to say that's a difficult situation to be in on the defensive side, because I've got resources, I've got resources, and you've got to come up with something that will push through all of those resources. So when I pose that question, you've got to have the answer. Well, now you've got to flip that around. If your offense, if you think it is so good, how do you beat your own offense? If it's easy to beat your own offense with your defense, then your offense isn't very isn't very robust. It isn't asking a difficult enough question. Now, if it's asking a difficult enough question and your defense is able to do it, but it takes these resources, a handful of resources, to get blocks consistently, then that's probably a decent balance between offense and defense. And I think you need to make sure that your defense is built in a way that answers a variety of questions, a broad range of questions, or at the very least, if you're playing in a local play group, find out what questions you're going to be asked the most often. If I play Jay Chambers, for anyone that doesn't know, from Michigan now. He used to be in Alabama. But when we used to play against each other, more times than not, you could see him playing flood. Now, he did have an entire tournament season where he went away from it, and he tried out various decks, and he did really well with all of the decks he tried. But he's known for playing flood, almost to a fault, even though I will acknowledge that he's broken away from that a good bit. But the point is, I know that the question is possibly going to be posed of flood survivors with their add to battle, with their rainbow. So when I start building a defense, I have to have that question in mind because I have to have an answer for it. And I think every time you start to build a deck, you have to think about what's going to be out there and start figuring out how you're going to answer those questions. Do you typically think about the kind of decks that you expect to play when you build out your defense so that you can answer a variety of things?
Oh, 100%. And not just in like local, you mentioned locals, and we've got online locals, and we've got the Lackey Grand Prix too, but we got Nats coming up too. So I'm already big, like, what am I expecting? Obviously I'm going to see a lot of people playing the New Testament Gold, the Disciples, just because their new cars are popular. But I've also seen different things as far as post-exilic. I've seen, we forget that the Daniel deck got that great new Michael, and then your buddy Brad's got a new David's Harp to play with. So Ruth has kind of got a boost. You kind of have to like look at what's going on in the meta. And again, just figure out what you think they're going to play. And you need to know, am I building this defense? Do I have an answer for the Noah with the unlimited resources? Do I have an answer for the big Zerubbabel banding chain? Do I have an answer for Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, Michael, and sometimes I've even seen Joshua thrown in there too. Like, you have to kind of consider what you're expecting to play. And so when I plug into my defense now, I'll build my defense and I look, okay, can I answer this? Can I answer that? Can I block that? And you got to think of the counters they're going to have down. They may have something that's, negating characters, doing this. So you probably need to include some CBP, CBN. If they're playing hand manipulation, you should probably include something that's going to grab you something from reserve because, Voice from Heaven is here, but you just kind of have to have a mix. And if your defense is set up to be like, I'm just going to go in and just beat people down with numbers, it's probably not going to work. And when I say numbers, I mean like the Goliath and, bringing fear. Like the people who are going to come, it can work, but there's so many CBP, CBN stuff going on. You should probably incorporate that in your defense too. But exactly, just kind of agreeing with you said, John, you need to have a wide variety of answers. You can't just focus on answering a couple questions. And the biggest way is to go into the Discord, see what people are. There's times I'll be like, you see it all the time, looking for a game. I'll play somebody. I played 777 Godspeed the other day. And I've never played him before, but I just had a moment just to play him, just to, see what else is out there. And studying and knowing that is going to be a key to a successful defense.
Yeah. And you cannot put, like you mentioned, having the big numbers, even if you have a big numbers band, like what we used to call the Southeast defense. I guess technically we might still call it that, but you're using the King Resin band to, Captain of the Chariots or something like that. And you've got high numbers with Syrians, and you can grab a negate weapon or something like that from your reserve. Okay, well, that's well and good, but that doesn't answer every question that you're going to be posed. What if they get initiative and they play something CBN like, the new authority of Christ. And then vice versa. You can't just come in with low initiative characters like, I'm going to use Profane's daughter or Profane Daughters and go to my reserve, get unsuccessful, and that's going to be a guaranteed block every game. Because now when I push out Noah and I prevent, or when you play somebody that's playing Windows of Narrow Light with a meek offense, when you come across situations where unsuccessful is prevented and Profane Daughters is prevented, what are you going to do? And so you have to have a variety. Now, can you mix those? Sure. Those are both technically gray. You could have the Syrians with, a couple of chump block characters so that if you are going for initiative, you can do that as well. But you have to be able to answer a variety of questions that are going to be posed throughout the game. And then not only just a broad range of questions that you're expecting to see, you have to have the ability to know what block works when. You mentioned Goliath. Goliath is a fantastic block. Is Goliath a good block on turn 1? Absolutely. Is he a good block turn 1 from your reserve? Well, obviously not, because you have the delayed reserve access. So if you're putting him in your reserve, then you have to know that you can't rely on him until at least turn 2. So now you're getting into the mid-game part, when reserve access kicks in, round 2 or turn 2 and 3 of the game. And then I think 4 and beyond, we would consider that toward the late game. But where are your blocks and where are you strongest at blocking? Are you able to block early in the game, but if they string it out, you struggle late because of resources, because you don't have that many enhancements, things of that nature? Or are you not strong blocking early game and you get better as the game goes? And knowing that can kind of, okay, well, if I'm not good blocking early, and I know that that's the weakness of my defense, and I think my defense overall is still good, it struggles to block on turn 1. Well, potentially, maybe you give up that soul instead of blocking with limited resources and then losing a character early, and it'll also prevent them from playing enhancements in battle to gather additional resources. But knowing how your deck operates allows you to, and knowing the weakness, and that's kind of like when I mentioned pairing your offense. So when you've built this Matthew deck, are centered around Matthew turn 1. Do you know how to beat that if somebody plays that against you?
Oh yeah. So, Matthew coming in turn 1, you're probably not going to stop him just from the fact that, I don't play Storehouse as much, but it's very, like I said before, if they come at you turn 1, Matthew, the chances that you've been able to put Storehouse or 4 Living Creatures or any of those cards that the hand protection is very, very minimal. But definitely, I would say I've been messing around. This is all Tyler's brainchild. Give him a shout out, but a Demon Roman kind of mix, and they're pretty good. My brother is also messing around with the Disciples. We kind of had like a mirror match, and it was like, we didn't play it on timeline, but it was probably close to 2 hours on one game. We just couldn't punch through. So that defense is pretty good against it.
Yeah.
When you've got characters protected against New Testament and dominance, and so the authority of Christ doesn't work. Eventually they get to the choose the blocker with Simon, but even that they all banned most of them. So you really have like 1 or 2 targets to choose, because if they choose Red Dragon, then he's going to ban a couple of the characters. So there's ways to answer it.
True.
And so when we were looking at that, that's one of the ways that we came up with. But I at least want to give Tyler the credit for the Demon Romans.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Credit to whoever comes up with these great ideas for decks. And ideas are constantly being reused by other players and adapted and things of that nature. That's kind of the point of these games, is you see something that's cool and you can go and emulate it in your own style. But I just wanted to ask the question because you know where your offense struggles. You know what kind of defense it struggles against. So if you see that, then you know, okay, I'm in trouble and I've got to find a way around this. You have to identify the weaknesses of your own deck. There is no deck out there, not a single deck out there, that doesn't have a weakness. I would even say that, like if you're talking about the Widow deck, that's, causing a fuss right now. It has weaknesses. It has a chance to brick out on the combo turn one. But if you do get the turn combo off, generally you're okay. But if they've got an answer for it in their opening 8, and you fall behind getting the combo off turn one, and they put down enough things to stop you to where you can't push that combo through the next turn, that deck is getting massively annihilated because it's not built to play a standard game. It's built to race out to an advantage and then put down enough counters that you can never come back from it. So if you can stall it out on turn one, which is extremely hard to do, I will give you that. But if you do it, then that deck doesn't have a lot of agility to recover, so to speak. So knowing the weakness of your deck allows you to protect against it with your play style with the deck. So that'll take us to so we've talked offense, we've talked defense. That brings us to support and consistency of your deck. So dominance and lost souls are crucial for supporting your deck strategy. Generally, there's 4 or 5 dominants that people are going to agree, and this is straight from Thoughts from Portland this week. So if you want to take this information, and then if you haven't listened to Thoughts from Portland, go and hear a more advanced talk about dominance. You can go and do that. But generally, there's 4 to 5 that are almost for a player staple dominance. And that just means that every deck that you build, if it's a staple, it's more than likely going in that deck, any deck that you build. So Son of God is absolutely a staple right now for pretty much every deck, unless you're running Chariot of Fire. So it's a staple because it goes in every deck. So that's what staple means. And then you have flex dominant slots, which are like if we agree that there's 5 staple dominants, which is what Jay and John mentioned on their podcast, that you have Son of God, Second Coming, Three Woes, Chronicles, and potentially Angel of the Lord is 5. Then you've got 6 and 7 that are flex dominants, that based on the deck and what the deck strategy is. So if you're playing Impartial Judgment, you need to have Awesome Things so that you can pull that off pre-block. If you are playing Hand Control, you probably want to make sure you have Shipwreck if they're running Storehouse. It's just kind of a ebb and flow. Like, you have to have the answer for the problem for your deck strategy. So you have to know what stops your deck. And then you use your dominance and your consistency and support pieces to make sure you have the answer for what causes your deck problems. Fortresses and artifacts and stuff like that can help you push your strategy. But I think it's one of those things that I know that John made a joke that you could build your deck with 7 lost souls and 43 artifacts on the podcast. It's not going to get you very far. It's actually going to get you very not far. Like, it's an auto loss is what it is. And obviously it's a joke, but the point is that honestly, when it comes to fortresses, artifacts, and things like that, those can be easily overdone. So easily. One version of the King Noah deck, and I showed this to Tyler when we did Tyler and Jeremy when we did the Royal Rangers demo last summer in Alabama. And I had at that time, I think it was 4 or 5 fortresses, and all of them offered a benefit. And I ended up playing Jeremy with a deck that he thought was going to be, one that could potentially push for top cut at nationals and push to win. And it was a throne-based deck, and I beat him. And I was feeling pretty good about my deck. I had 5 fortresses. At one point, I got down to, I think it was 2 fortresses. And the deck ran so much faster, more consistent, and more streamlined. It's not that those cards didn't offer a benefit, but at a certain point, you have to weigh the benefit with the cost of that card slot. And that goes back to evaluating every single card slot for your overall deck strategy. So I know that I've definitely built decks where I've been a little heavy on, the support pieces. Have you ever ran into that issue, Rob?
Yeah. Actually, one of the iterations that I had of the whatever we work, it doesn't have a name, Speed Disciples, whatever you want to call it. I think I had probably 6 artifacts, 4 fortresses, or something like that. And I was like, it's getting a little clunky. And it's if you remember what I was talking about earlier, it's getting away from what I'm trying to accomplish, that turn one Matthew, to, yeah, those were some counters that I wanted to put down because I was running Shield, I was running Babel. I think I also had Treacherous Land in there, Jerusalem. I had a lot of different things. I was like, wait a minute, if I get an opening hand that's most of those, that's not going to get my goal done. So I kind of had to like back off on some things. Like, okay, I need to make sure that I'm getting to what this deck was designed to do. And some of the things that we plugged in, when I look at like, okay, like Lost Souls, Dominance, all those support cards you mentioned, Fortresses, Sites, Artifacts, I look at them all collectively as kind of like a support system, like you're calling it. And no matter what kind of deck that you're playing, what kind of theme, like your King Noah deck, and my Matthew deck, that offense for both of us is not going to have every question that we could possibly answer. And it's not going to be able to stop every counter that is thrown at us. So looking at those support cards, whether it is a Fortress, Site, Dominant, Soul, you should be taking those to kind of plug in where the weaknesses is on your offense and your defense. Just a quick example, like one of my flex doms went to Shipwreck because on the offset that I don't get Matthew turn one and they open Storehouse, well, that just stops Matthew from doing what he needs to do. So I'm going to play Shipwreck to potentially punch through that, which is, you want to think what your deck's going to be weak to and kind of get through it. You mentioned earlier about Noah coming in and with his ability going off and all those different things and having Profane Daughters in your hand. But if you just simply throw in the Humble Soul, your cards can't be prevented, and that's a modifier. They can't negate it. So that's a way to use those support cards to maybe pick up the slack where your defense or your offense might run into an issue with.
Absolutely. Humble Soul was the bane of King Noah's existence.
Yeah.
If they had that down. And the good thing about the way that I built that deck, though, because I knew that people could easily do Humble, and this is like the next step of when you identify an issue and know where you're weak. Okay, so I was weak if someone had Humble Soul and I had a handful of cards. Well, I just told you that I built the deck at one point that had a lot of fortresses, had a lot of support pieces. It had a ton of things that I could play down so that I went into battle with limited cards in my hand, and then I was able to generate battle winners from the deck mid-battle, like in the battle phase, and by, Book of the Law, top decking, drawing off Jeshua, so that I could always make sure that I had a resource to win a battle, but it wasn't to the point to where I've got 12 cards in my hand, because I knew that the deck was weak when I played someone that had Humble Lost Soul. So you start to identify the weakness, find the solution for the weakness, and then start to answer their solution that they have against your deck strategy. So it just keeps compounding and you're constantly evolving, and that's where we talk about you're constantly changing your deck, because once they find an answer for your deck, now you've got to find an answer for their answer. You've got to constantly be evolving that deck, and when it gets to the point to where you can't evolve it anymore to answer what is it's weak against, then you're probably towards the end of the life cycle for that deck. Until a new set or the game state moves in a different direction, and then you can pull it back out.
Not to mean to cut you off there, but like if you're playing your deck and you notice, man, every time they play this evil brigade or this evil character, I just get shut down and I lose. Well, it's time to find an answer for that.
Yep, and if you cannot find an answer for it, then that's not a super competitive deck, because it just falls apart as soon as somebody plays X, Y, and Z. If they're playing Black Brigade and they can, string out a couple of Philistines that have negate abilities. Okay, well, if you don't have any answer for that and you can't make an answer for that within your deck in the deck building phase, then you are acknowledging that as soon as they play that brigade or whatever, that sub-theme, Philistines, whatever, that you lose. And you can't concede big weaknesses like that. You want your weakness to be Storehouse, which then you can add an answer for Storehouse. You don't want your weakness to be an entire brigade or something like that. So you also need to gauge how serious the weakness of your deck is. And when you find that answer, if it takes you completely changing half your deck to have an answer for an issue that you're seeing, well, then you have to go back and evaluate the entire deck at that point. If it's one or two cards that answer this and you can change those and tech those, then you're adapting to the meta, basically, or what you're expecting to see in the meta. But if you're having to change a ton of cards in your deck, then your deck isn't overly optimized at that point, or it's hard to optimize it because it's not a very strong strategy for achieving your win condition, if that makes sense. So definitely, I know that it's come up several times about mana. You've seen people talk, newer players, and I'm not talking down about anyone. Me and Rob are here just giving tips on deck building that we've learned from experience. I'm not some master deck builder. I think you would acknowledge that you're not either. We're just offering tips and things, so we're not saying that anyone is, a bad player because they want to use this card, but mana has come up as a discussion piece a couple of times, and I've told people that I think it's fool's gold because it's got one of those abilities to where you're like, okay, this seems pretty good, but it's not impactful enough for it to take up your art activation each turn. It's absolutely not. And I don't see any reason to ever run that card. I don't even consider that card exists most of the time. And that's not to say that I'm some great wisdom on redemption cards, but I just don't think the cost of that card in a slot of a 50 card deck is worth it when you have other options that achieve similar, consistency pieces and whatnot. So you also have to gauge back to evaluating every single card slot in your deck, what makes sense for the deck overall and what puts the deck in the best position to be successful. Like I mentioned, taking away some of those fortresses and it making my deck operate more streamlined. Now, obviously, I didn't have the benefit of that. I didn't have one of the ones I cut was Ark of Salvation, which when Noah went into battle, he could top deck a Genesis card, which could be drawn off of Jeshua, which is an additional battle resource. But at a certain point, my reserve evolved to where I had one, maybe two Genesis cards that I would want to pull. So I was mostly using it for protecting my Noah while he's in territory so that they couldn't hit him with something like Christian Martyr. And then, I'd have to have faith or another way to get him back from discard pile. So eventually I cut that, didn't need it for the battle resource, and it made my deck more streamlined, but I was weakened to them being able to Christian Martyr my Noah. Well, how did I answer that? Was at a certain point I started using Solomon's Temple because it gained me the extra place to activate Book of the Law or Book of the Covenant. And with my Noah being a king of Judah off of a royal priesthood, I could pitch a Till card to stop a discard ability on Noah. So I kind of identified it made me weaker here to something. I got rid of Ark of Salvation. Solomon's Temple came in, and boom, bada bing, bada boom. You answer how you made yourself weaker to something. You answer it right back. And I think I was using Solomon's Temple at one point, and actually it was three fortresses, I think, in the most streamlined version, because I still had Throne of David, obviously, Threshing Floor, and Solomon's Temple, but still not 5. And I cut down having artifacts that couldn't be active because I added an extra spot to activate one when I added Solomon's Temple. So we'll kind of transition off of the support and consistency, and we'll move into general tips and ideas for deck building. Have you ever, Rob, just taken someone else's deck and played it straight up?
Actually, borrowed one of Jaden's, actually, and I think he knows that, his What's the Deal with Teal. And so I borrowed that and just played it. Yeah, and I borrowed. Well,
you won an online tournament.
I just started playing it, and I had never played Priest before, so I had to get some games in before I even did it. But yeah, I ended up winning an online tourney. I will say this: I believe me and you have had this conversation before. Just because you borrow a deck that looks good does not mean you're going to go and wreck people. The person who built it a certain way, and they may pilot it different than you, and you're just gonna not know why a certain card's in there. Um, but yeah, and eventually down the road, I did make changes. I ended up like dropping certain cards for this, and once I understood how, like, okay, I've played a couple times. This is what Jaden meant for this deck to do. What can I change to fit my play style? And then I think I posted something on the boards about, after I won the online tournament, like, this is what I had and this is what I changed to kind of do what I wanted to do, and kind of fit me. But you have to understand, if you do that, I mean, I think they call that net decking. But if you do that, it's not a bad thing, but you need to play it, and maybe ask that person, hey, just want to let you know I'm trying out your deck. Why is this card in here? Why is this card in there? And make yourself familiar with it before you start changing it, because if you don't know how it's run and you change cards, you could just mess up everything they were trying to build.
Yep. But the main point is that you've done it, I've done it, everyone's done it, seen a deck list of a deck that they thought was pretty strong, and then they've taken it, even if they weren't planning to play it, but to learn it, to know how to play against it. This game, the way that it is set up, there's a reason that people share deck lists. You know why? Because you need to take that deck and you need to plug it in and you need to figure out what it's trying to do. And it might be a deck that you like and you want to run, or you could at least gain knowledge of how to play against it. Like, find out what it's trying to achieve so that when you see someone playing it, you know how to answer it. You know how to find the answer to the question. But that's the reason that decks are shared, is so that we can share these ideas in decks and that people can get familiar with them, to where we have more solid competition versus, oh, well, I've never seen post exilics when I sit down to play them and they just warp me with, speed and negating my neutrals. Well, if you know what that deck's trying to do and you know how important certain pieces are to the deck, then you know which ones you need to answer. So you can, for various reasons, you can copy a deck list and gain information from that. You can even find decks that you might want to play and pilot as your own deck for a tournament. So don't be afraid to copy deck lists. They're shared for that very reason. And then another one, like you mentioned, you've been doing some work with Luke on the Matthew deck, and then you've been working with Tyler on that defense. So collaborate with a group. Find a couple of people, even if they're your same skill level, and just bounce ideas off of them. Or, like you mentioned, if you ask someone on boards or Discord, you're going to get an answer 95% of the time when you ask questions. Now, if you ask a broad question like, how can I make this deck better? And then I look at your deck and I'm like, well, I don't think you can make this deck better, because what you're trying to do, from what I see, is not going to work, at least not for the same type of tournament games that I'm playing. And then I don't necessarily have an answer for you that's not just like, I don't know how you do that. Then I probably wouldn't answer in that situation, because I don't have a positive suggestion for you to fix that deck. And you didn't ask for honest feedback if my deck sucks. Now, if you did that, then maybe we'd have a conversation. But you get what I'm saying. Like, if you ask for ideas generally, if a deck can be improved, you're going to get suggestions on how to improve it. If you don't get any suggestions, then
I think
take
so, John,
that how
too.
you
Like,
will.
I mean, I've played other card games. I've played Yu-Gi-Oh! And Pokemon as well, and those kind of communities, like, if any of our newer players, or especially if they're coming from those communities are very toxic, and everything's kept a secret. And if you copy a deck, they even call you like, yo, you're a net deck, and you have no skill, you're just copying, and they keep everything hush hush. So some of these new people might be hesitant, thinking that that's how it's going to be treated, but that's not how we are in this community. I mean, after I started, me and Luke were working on it, and like you said, I started talking with Tyler, and I've even spoke with Jaden, and recently John Early, just messaging these people who are top tier players and just say, hey, what do you think of this? What do you think of that? As opposed to those other communities, they're like, no, I'm not telling you my secrets. I'm not telling you what I'm doing. Like, this community is much more open. I just want to reiterate that fact that go talk to these people. Go talk to them. They're gonna answer you. I mean, you might be stuck on a card. I mean, we use the mana example, but if they're telling you like, yeah, it's just kind of niche right now. I mean, kind of take their experience and go, okay, they probably know a little better than me, but don't be afraid. They're going to be very open to talk to you.
Yeah, I think this game doesn't keep complete decks to themselves, and more so like tweaking and having certain techs and meta calls within a deck is what maybe they keep more close to the vest when it comes to nationals and whatnot. Like if you're expecting to see, I don't know, you're expecting to see more animal defense, and then you tech for that somehow, then maybe that's something that like I'm expecting to see that with my knowledge of the meta. Now I'm not going to share that when somebody asks me about a deck per se, if I'm a top tier player going close to nationals or whatnot. But if you ask me generally about the deck, I'm playing Green Prophets. Okay, well that doesn't tell you overall the strategy and whatnot. So I definitely think there's information that's shared at will, and I think it's freely given most of the time. But another thing, and this is something that came up, I know that I saw Jaden mention it a while back when someone asked him, they gave him credit for being, at the very top of our game currently. And, if you asked anybody, he'd be probably top 2 in the game right now, top 1 or 2, depending on, who you ask. We did have Josh win nationals and then come back and win the first Lackey Grand Prix. So, he's right up there as well. And you end up looking for, I guess, bits of wisdom from players that are in that type of position and what they did to get there. And one of the things that Jaden suggested was to pick a theme, pick a brigade, and just learn it inside and out. And figure that out before you move on to something, instead of just playing this deck a time or two and then moving to something else. Learn it inside and out. That way you can always come back to it, pick it back up if it comes back in style, so to speak. And then, before you move on to something else, because a lot of times we're dabbling in so many things, but we're not exploring them fully. And the best way that I can describe this, I know a lot of people thoroughly enjoyed the sports references that we had the last time you were on with myself and Brad, and we were talking football. So I'll switch it up and I'll give you a fishing analogy. Okay, so as an avid bass fisherman, I'm not that good, trust me, but I want to be good. But fishermen always talk about confidence in baits and lures. So bass fishing, you have several different categories of baits. You have topwater baits, fast-moving baits, slow-moving baits. You have soft plastics. You've got bottom baits, jigs, all kinds of things. And then within all of those, you have, like spinner baits, crankbaits, lipless crankbaits, square bills, buzz baits, spooners, all kinds of things. Just throwing out that there's literally hundreds of lures and things that you can throw. But fishermen always talk about having confidence in a certain bait. So that means that they've taken a crankbait and they fished it in certain conditions so much that when those conditions are right, that's the bait that they're going to, because they have confidence in it. They've caught fish on it before. One of the baits that people have the most confidence in is a Texas rig soft plastic. So where you have a bullet weight, you can peg it or not, and you've got a 3/0 hook, 4/0 hook, and a soft plastic worm.
You lost me,
This
John.
is probably talking over everyone's head, but but the point is, generally that's a sliding weight. Peg it doesn't move, and it's just right on the hook, and then you string a soft plastic worm and you fish it slow. And generally that's a confidence bait for most bass fishermen, that if they're not catching it on anything else, they're going to throw that because they know that they can get bites with it. And I think that if you take that and then you put it back in redemption terms, I think people are so quick to switch between decks sometimes that they don't build confidence in a deck. So like I have confidence in blue because I started out playing Flood Survivors. Then I switched up and went to a blue counter deck with the release of Lineage of Christ. And then that shifted into King Noah. So if you tell me to put together a deck and I've got 15 minutes to do it, I'm probably going to grab Lackey and go to blue because I know it the best out of the things that I've played. I think everyone should have at least one brigade or one theme that they can lean into that way and feel like they know it inside and out. And I think a lot of new players struggle with, oh, well, I want to figure this out, and then I want to figure that out. I played somebody that was playing that deck, and that deck looked really good, and now I want to play that. And they just switch back and forth so much that they don't build confidence in anything. So then you have the situation where they don't feel like they can get solid rescues with this deck. They don't feel like they can get blocks with it. But they're not sticking with it long enough to try to find the problem with the deck and fix it. And my observation is I think that's a serious thing that's happening with a lot of newer players within the game right now.
Oh, I agree.
Do you think that's a
seen,
fair assessment?
Then again, we won't ever throw names or anything, but I've seen people do that, and they're just like, they were playing this, but I didn't like that, and I switched it to do that, how did you test that deck out? Yeah, I played 2 games, I lost both of them, so I'm done with it. And it's like, well, that's really not an accurate test. Going back to my Matthew deck right here, or mine and Luke's, whatever you want to call it, but I've gone through 4 different defenses. The offense has pretty much stayed the same, but I've swapped out defenses 4 times. So it's just going to keep going through iterations until I find that it's better. And then, of course, the last defense, that's when Tyler messaged me. He's like, hey, test this defense out for me. And I said, sure. I'll plug it in and see how it works. But you can't give up. You can't just, once you hit that brick wall and you start losing with it, you have to remember losing is learning. And I've said that to a couple people before. It's just when you lose, why did I lose? What beat me? Okay, now it's just like we talked earlier in the discussion. Now that I know how I lost, I know what questions that I got asked that I didn't have an answer for. So now I know what I have to do in that deck to tweak it to make sure that doesn't happen again. But I would encourage anybody who's building decks or just getting in this game, like don't let it defeat you. I mean, I played just like you, John. I played Flood Survivors for like 2 years. I got to the point where I could, in 5 minutes, build a flood deck and know it in and out, and that went through so many iterations. I lost so many times with it, but towards the end, I started winning more and more, being familiar, knowing what I might see, knowing what stops the deck, and you have to be persistent and figuring those things out, or every time you go to switch to a new deck after 2 games, you're going to have the same result.
Yeah, and that's not to mean that if you stick with every deck, you're going to end up winning with it. Some decks, just like I said, if you keep finding the problem with the deck and you keep trying to address it, but you're not able to address it to where you're consistently putting yourself in a position to win, then maybe that deck's at the end of its life cycle. And sometimes that end of a life cycle comes very soon. Like I built this deck last month, and I played 10, 12 games with it. And it's just every time I play, it's just not performing. Well, sometimes you just need to scrap the deck, and the deck just doesn't work the way that you intended for it to. But you've learned that over the course of testing that deck out. And I mean, if we're going to be honest, the last deck that I think I kind of scrapped too early was I built a Grace Like a Flood. It was kind of a twist on Noah. Instead of making him king, it was using the Mary Protect and never controlling an enhancement in battle by using Throne of Grace just to pitch a single brigade good enhancement if they tried to remove him from battle. And I played that deck at 57. I played it at 52. And then I finally played it at 50. I lost all 3 games. The game at 50 was pretty competitive, but I lost it. And I kind of scrapped that deck. And it doesn't mean that I'll never go back to it, but GOC also came out and was coming out, and so that kind of influenced it. But on one of the early episodes of Thoughts from Portland, John mentioned that he told me that I shouldn't scrap the deck. I should just keep trying to work it. But, that's the situation to where maybe that deck turns out to be a really good deck at some point. But if I never go back to it and I've just closed the book on it, then I've done myself a disservice with, a deck idea that I came up with. I don't know if it's good. I've played 3 games with it, and one of those was competitive. I haven't tweaked enough things to know if I'm able to tweak it to answer the meta, or if it's just not going to be able to do that.
I think cut you off. I think too a good test, like because you said, okay, well 2 weeks is not long enough to scrap one, but then sometime it might come time to scrap it. I think a good way to test that is to play multiple different decks against it. Like, I can't just play my brother 10 times when I'm testing a deck because he's going to have the same deck. So I'm not really getting a good variety. If you play 10 different types of other decks and you lose to 9 out of 10 of them, you might consider scrapping at that point because you're getting beat by too many things. But if you're playing 10 other things and you only lose to one certain type of deck, it might just boil down to a couple corrections to have counters to that.
Yeah, and at a certain point, competitive play is going to turn into not necessarily straight up rock, paper, scissors, but there's going to be something that you're weak against, and you're going to be strong against everything. You can't answer every question, and you can't have an answer for everything that would be posed to you. But what you can do is have the most. If you're answering most things and you're just weak to this one thing, well, I can almost live with that if I know that. So if I see it coming, I prepare myself and I try to work around it. But like you said, if you're losing to a majority of things, then maybe that's time to wrap it up. But another thing that's come up on the Discord recently is, especially with this combo, and I'm not calling anyone out about that because you feel how you feel about the combo. It'll be answered or it won't, and we'll all have to live with the decision at some point when the elders say that they're going to do something or they're not. But until that answer comes, we've got to live with it. So you either do one of two things. You prepare to play against it, or you try to run the best version of it that you can. I think that's the fair assessment in a competitive space. So Lackey Grand Prix is a competitive space. And I think you've got to decide whether you're going to try to run the best version of the Widow deck or if you're going to tech against it. Or I guess there is a third option where you talk to the person that you're playing and you agree not to play the combo, either player. But you have to identify what the meta is. And right now it's heavily weighted towards, it's more than likely everyone agrees. I won't say that everyone does, but an unfair combo deck because it's, creating an infinite loophole of utilizing 2 cards to completely deck out. And then you can add in another card that gets rid of all the evil cards. And, you're creating a situation where you're outpacing the opponent by getting all those counters down. And so the combo is what it is. But I think you have to acknowledge what the meta is in any tournament season. And then you have to make a call for your deck and how you're going to answer that. And that's kind of like what we mentioned earlier about when you start to build that defense and your opponents are going to pose questions to you. What questions do you expect to see the most often? So it's almost like you're reading, when you say reading the meta, that's finding out what questions are going to be posed to you and making sure your deck answers enough of those to put you in a position to win more often than not. And I think when I first started, I didn't think about what an opponent was going to play because I thought if I brought a strong enough offense to the table, it didn't matter what defense they play. But that's not the case. Generally, there's going to be some defensive strategy or tactic that's going to trip you up no matter how good you think your offense is. And I found that out from experience. I think the only one that you could probably say you're confident in no matter what you play against was the Throne deck that had the Isaiah band after Lineage of Christ came out. But you have to identify what you think other people are going to play so that you can make sure you have the answers for that in your deck. And I do that more so now from the very beginning of building a deck. I don't know if you do that same thing, Rob, or not. But like when I start to build a deck and we talk about you pick your offense first, well, I'm going to pick an offense that, answers several different things that I think people are going to be playing defensively right now. So if you think they're going to be playing, Sadducees, Pharisees, and manipulating meek lost souls, protecting them from rescue and whatnot. Well, now you've got to make sure that your offense, your rescue opportunities, have an answer for that built in from the very beginning of your deck. And so I've started to build that at the very beginning of the deck building phase as opposed to building the deck and then answering the question or trying to find the answers for what I think other people are playing. What's your process with that? Do you do it at the very beginning,
right there
or do you do it after you build a deck?
And again, we mentioned it before. I am no way or shape or form excellent or what I would consider the great deck builder, but I think as of recent it's gotten a lot better, and I'll purposely when I told you when I first get to like whatever it is 20 heroes 10 hands, I'm starting to cut down, I'm going to look and go, okay, I'm expecting to see this, expecting to see that, and you're right, you're not going to cover every single thing, but if you have a card that hits multiple things, it can help you kind of like with that. I mentioned that the Roman demon defense kind of shut down my deck. I don't know why I wasn't playing Love One Another, but I am now, because I'm going to be able to convert the humans and bounce everybody else, and that's regardless of protectability. So when they hit me with that big protection ban, I'm going to be able to do that. And then if I'm using Bartholomew, it's CBN. So I started including that in, like, okay, I'm expecting to see this now. I need to kind of do that. But you have to. It's the same way with the defense. You can't just pick the defense around the meta. Your offense should have enhancements or characters that are going to have a question that's going to make them go, does my defense have an answer for that? Like, you have to consider the meta on both sides, offensively and defensively. So, yeah, I do the same thing.
And I will even touch back to when we mentioned Lost Souls and Dominance. And I know that we mentioned having answers for things with those and those supporting your strategy or knowing what hurts your deck strategy and them being answers for that. But when you identify what the meta is going to be, what you expect to see, especially in a tournament setting, because everything that we're talking about is for a competitive atmosphere, competitive space. We're trying to do it on basic terms so that all terminology is kind of explained and whatnot, so that, we're not talking above anyone's familiarity with the game, but we're also talking about building decks for a highly competitive space from a beginner's, perspective. So if you're a casual player, some of these things don't necessarily apply to you if you're just having fun playing the game. But if you want to be competitive and try to win local tournaments, win the online local, these are things that you need to think about and apply to that. And when it comes to identifying the meta and what you expect to play against, Lost Souls, and I know that Meek Souls have become playable, especially with some of the defenses from GOC. But if you're playing ability souls, some of those abilities can really help you answer what you expect to see in the meta. So if you expect to see their Akeem, and you can play Distressed. And I know that Hunter has kind of fallen out, but if you can, play Hunter to go to Distressed in the opening 8 to try to get your Distressed Lost Soul down so that they can't hit you with territory class negate characters, then, that's something that you can prepare, because you're going to see a territory class negate in pretty much every deck at the current moment. I think that's pretty fair to say. Yep. I think I see one in every deck. Is that, yeah. And if you don't see it, then you're seeing someone that's building their deck with heavy counters to where they're, trying to get the calf down to negate and then, layer that with the cross and things like that. But generally, even those type of decks are still playing a negate neutral, negate characters in other territories, just layering all of that to build a minefield that you have to step through. So you got to know what you're going to play in order to build the best deck to answer the most things. And if you start thinking about that, especially at the beginning of the deck building phase, like we mentioned that we do now, it obviously I did not do that at the very beginning. Absolutely did not. But now when I go to build a deck, that's what I'm thinking. Honestly, to the point to where it makes it a little bit more difficult to build decks because I want to feel confident that, and that's another thing where I mentioned building confidence. Sometimes you just got to play it to build it, but sometimes I'll go to build a deck and I'll I don't know if this is, and Brad could attest to this, but I don't know if this is going to answer enough issues that I'm planning on seeing. So I don't feel confident in this deck. And then I'll, halfway build it and then never finish it because I just didn't see it answering enough things. And sometimes you just need to build it and play it. And that's where my struggle is personally, is just trusting that it's going to be able to be competitive. I don't want to, quote unquote, waste my time with a deck that's not going to be competitive and answer enough things. But I definitely am thinking about that when I build my deck. And if you want to be competitive and have a chance to win some of these tournaments, that's what you're going to have to start thinking about all the way from the beginning of the deck building phase, so that every decision you make is supporting your strategy, which is how you are going to attempt to outrace your opponent to the win condition. And outrace doesn't mean I've got to do it in 3 turns. You could do it in 5 turns if you're building your defense to get blocks. It's a balancing act. Your defense has to help give you time to achieve what you need to as far as your rescue opportunities. And you need to make sure that your rescue opportunities are strong. You're asking a really difficult question without dedicating too many resources to that to where it weakens your ability to get blocks on the other end. Anything else that you would like to add, Rob, in closing?
Be flexible. That's what I would say. Just because something doesn't work out doesn't mean that it's bad. You just got to swap out a card here, swap out a card there. You've got to be flexible. You can't just be stuck on an idea like this is what I want to do. But if you're getting shut down, then obviously what you want to do is not working. You have to be flexible to make some sort of change, and also not to be the little bird that keeps bending over, hitting the keyboard button over and over, but ask questions. If you don't know the answer, like if you're new and you're like, well, I don't know what the meta is. I don't play the Grand Prix. I'm not on local tourneys. Ask. People will tell you. So I don't want to keep beating that one, but that's the most common thing. And honestly, that's what's helped me so much recently, is just being able to reach out to people and talk to them, discuss ideas and ask them questions. It'll help you a lot.
And you mentioned to me that was your goal after Nationals, was you wanted to start reaching out and having some other people to bounce things off of. And then here we are. What is this? Almost 6 months after Nationals. Actually, no, a little after, right?
Yeah.
So 6-7 months after Nationals, and you think you've improved as a deck builder by doing one simple thing, which is just reaching out and asking questions. So you definitely can get better. No matter what level you're at, you can always get better. No one comes to this game, and as long as you understand the basic mechanics of the game, you can always improve as a deck builder. If anyone tells you you can't, take that advice, ball it up, and throw it away. Nobody's telling you you're going to be the best deck builder, but you can always improve.
Nobody knows the day or the hour he's coming back, and nobody's going to be the best deck builder.
Yeah, right on. So we'll go ahead and end it here. I want to thank you all for listening to this episode number 22, actually, climbing up in the numbers. So thanks again, Rob, for joining. I know it was last minute, me asking you. I got inspired by the conversation you guys were having on Discord today, and I was like, okay, let's try doing that. So thank Rob for coming on and doing that kind of last minute here. I want to remind everyone to get your Lackey Grand Prix round 4 games in. Currently, at the time of this recording, they are not posted yet. But, okay, I stand corrected. They just posted. So, make sure you get your Lackey Grand Prix games in, and we'll talk to you next week. Peace. All right. Thank you guys for listening to this week's episode. I want to thank Rob for coming on kind of last minute to talk about some of this. I was inspired by the conversation that was being had on Discord today, so I kind of changed plans last minute to kind of talk about this topic. I just thought it kind of worked well for right now where we are in the game with a lot of new players. So hopefully you took something from this that will benefit you, and give you different things to think about as you build your deck. And we'll talk to you next week on episode number 23. Thanks again. Peace.